Hey everybody, this is Tim Green with Rattle Magazine, and the following is my conversation with Ani DiFranco, which appeared in issue number 85 of Rattle, and was recorded on May 23rd, 2024. We talked about the relationship between poetry and music, creativity in the subconscious, trauma, public cancellation, and more. Widely considered a feminist icon, Grammy winner Ani DiFranco was one of the first artists to create her own record label in 1990. While she's been known as a folk singer, her music has embraced punk, funk, hip-hop, jazz, soul, electronica, and more. Her most recent album, just out this year, is Unprecedented Shit. Her memoir, No Walls and the Recurring Dream, was a New York Times top 10 bestseller, and her debut children's book, The Knowing, is out now. DiFranco was starring on Broadway as Persephone in the Tony and Grammy Award-winning Best Musical Hadestown when this interview was conducted. So I hope you enjoy this. I really did. We'll be back next week with a regular live episode of the Rattlecast. So it has been such like a dream of mine to talk to you. I've been the editor of Rattle, this little magazine, for 20 years, and for 20 years I've wanted to talk to you about poetry, because I do think that your songs work as poems, like on a page, in a way that other songwriters don't usually. And your use of imagery and metaphor and things like that. There's so much poetry involved in what you do. And I always wanted to know what your background is in poetry, like where, the young Ani back in Buffalo, New York. Did you start reading poetry at that age? I knew later at the, New School, you worked with Sekou Sundiata. But before that, were there poems? Was it an interest of yours before you started writing songs even?
Well, yes. Yes, I think poetry was my first love. Really got me into the love of language and manipulating it and distilling it, especially, which poetry is so good at, even before songs. And I'm happy to hear you say that you hear poetry in my songs, because when I was anticipating this interview, I was feeling like a fraud, because you had asked ahead of time, well, if you have any new poems that you want to share, and I was thinking, holy cow, I haven't written a poem in I don't know how long. I barely write songs. I mean, I barely, do anything these days, now that I'm in an 8 show a week Broadway gauntlet. But yeah, it's been a while since I trained my gaze in the direction of poetry, unfortunately. So, but anyway, here I am. It was very much my first love, and I think really set me on the course that I've followed the rest of this time.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember like any, early poems that you read and enjoyed when you were a kid?
Well, I don't remember that. I mean, not as a child. I remember coming across Judy Grant's A Woman is Talking to Death,
Mm-hmm.
um, this sort of long epic poem that I came across when I was maybe 19 or 20. So still kind of a kid,
Mm-hmm.
and I remember just really being cracked open by that one. But as a kid, what I remember is this woman. Oh gosh, can I call her name up right now? Who came into my public school in Buffalo, New York, and was an artist in residence. She was this long-haired poet lady who first was the first person to talk to me about poetry and talk to us and encourage us to write poems. And I just loved her. I just loved her. And I think I remember her as the sort of the beginning for
Mm-hmm.
me.
Yeah, well, I had the same experience too. I had a poet came in my fifth grade class, and it turned out
Uh,
weirdly. Later, I found out she was longtime friends with my mom, which was such a
oh, wow.
fun thing to see. And I met her later. We published her in Rattle years after that. When
Uh,
so it's always cool. And it's just the introduction to poetry is so important for so many people, and you do that with your songs too. I mean, I do a workshop every Friday, and try to teach people how to become better writers and better communicators through poetry. And one of the things that comes up just so often is setting the image in the space. Like we're creating this sort of magical world with a poem or a song. I mean, it's really the same thing ultimately. and
Mm.
having those sort of a way that you can enter that world is so important. And one of the things you do with your songs all the time is start with imagery. Like one of the great examples I think is Shy, where you start out, the heat's so great, it plays tricks with the eye, and then you move into that bathroom and you see that whole scene
Hmm.
playing itself out before we enter the actual emotional state. You sort of give this sort of anchor that we can hold on to and enter as we're calling up poems. So what is your songwriting process like? I've always wondered how much it's like writing a poem. And so do you
Yeah.
remember composing a song like that? How does that come about?
Yeah. I mean, I love what you said about shy, and yeah, I guess that is something I intuitively do in songs, set the scene before the action takes place, so you can look around and be there. And I think not only can you be in the space of the moment, but you're also then even more in the head of the singer, as it were, if it's a song or speaker. Like you are looking through their eyes, because of course there's all these choices, and there's so much information in what you see, and how you describe what you see, so you're getting more into the head um, of the narrator. um, and I think, with music, of course, the music behind the word sets the tone and the
Mm-hmm.
space around it so much. So that is another tool to create mood and set it somewhere, and without the music, when it's just on the page, or in the air, with spoken word, I've always found that simultaneously a little more daunting, because the music can't help, create the feeling you're going for, and also more freeing, because it really is open-ended. The subtleties of tone of voice become that much more the music,
Mm-hmm.
that's conveying the mood, and how it's, and the speed and the rhythm of your delivery. And I'm so into the rhythm of language, and so you can really focus on that when, there's no music, preempting it with its own rhythm.
Mm-hmm. So, for most, does the melody come first for most of your songs? Like, do you start out in the guitar and then that conjures the words to start with, or does a line come to you and then you put the music to that?
Well, it happens always for me,
Mm-hmm.
all different ways, different every time. But I guess if your question was what's the most common? And I would say the most common is maybe the opposite, where it starts with, well, it always starts with a feeling, really. It always starts in the same place with a sense of something that has no words and no music.
Mm-hmm.
And then I go looking for the words or the music that invokes, that communicates that feeling or that color, that hue, that's I can feel so distinctly, so there's, I go looking for the tools to sculpt it, and that more often than not, I think, starts with words. It might be a line only that starts me in the direction of honing in on
Mm-hmm.
that feeling. Um, but yeah, I generally, I have journals that are just, or scraps of paper, or, everywhere, coming out of every pocket, that I try to jot down these senses or feelings that float through me.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then I go, pawing through my pile of scraps to look for ones to pursue and develop.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes it starts by hanging out with the guitar, um, and coming up with some musical context, and then following that into words, or, whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it's so interesting because it's so similar to how, a poet would work. A lot of times the first line is sort of that impetus, and there's a music to that which sort of
Yeah,
generates and like iterates and spins on itself into what the poem ends up being, whether it's like a free verse spoken word type thing, or if it's a, formal poem with the rhyme and meter working out. It's like the music of that first line, which is some kind of weird place that it comes from that we don't really know. It's a magical. I mean, that's why the word
totally.
muse exists, and that's what music
Yeah,
is. Um,
yeah,
it comes from that space, and then it sort of generates itself based on the sound. So it's really interesting to hear. That composition like that. The other thing I love about your music is how rich in metaphor it is. We have this thing, the Neil Postman Award for Metaphor, because Neil Postman championed metaphor as an instrument of perception, he called it, which it really is. It's the way we see the world is through metaphor. So we established this award that gives someone an award for the best use of metaphor in every year. And once we started doing that prize, you started to look just through each poem for the actual metaphors where they were. And they're even in contemporary poems that are like the best poems we can find. They're pretty rare, great original fresh metaphors. I mean, there's
wow,
a
yeah,
handful of, maybe like a dozen or 2 dozen of the 300 poems we publish every year, sort of in the running for that. And your songs are full of metaphors too. I mean, like, like a metaphor, like, I don't know, like Little Plastic Castle, like that one line metaphor moving into something else, or like Knuckle Down as a song, as a whole extended metaphor. And your poems or songs, I keep interplaying the two, are so rich with
sure, yeah.
metaphor. So where do those metaphors come from for you? Like, do they sort of spontaneously come out in the process? Do you think about them and add them? Where is there a source of
No,
metaphor?
yeah. Well, yeah, I don't add them in that I think you're picking up on that's the center of my writing is metaphor. I think, I mean, I just was thinking that while you were asking the question. I think that every song and I've said this before, I've heard myself say it. Oh my gosh. Sorry,
Oh, no
pause.
problem.
My phone was screaming in my ears for a second there. Um, yeah, I've heard myself say it a few times in my life when asked, "What is this song about?" People love to do that. Or who is this song about? People like to get to this concrete, what is this about? And when I'm faced with that question, the only way I can think to answer is it's not about that thing that I can point to or about that thing that's also there. It's about the connection. It's always and only ever, I think, for me, about the connection between the things.
Hmm.
That's what all of them are about, which is what metaphor is. I think that that's just what excites me as a writer is perceiving connections between things.
Hmm.
So I think, sort of metaphor is sort of the structure of the way I think as a writer and what compels me. So I guess it makes sense that my writing is full of them, but it's not like I want to write about that thing that I can point to and I look for metaphors. It's the metaphor is the thing.
Hmm. Yeah, I always think about it because we interviewed Ian McGilchrist for a previous issue, the psychologist, and he his whole book, the Master and His Emissaries, about the divided brain, and his whole thing is we actually are two people. We
Right.
developed that because as we come from this long line of billions of years of evolution, and we had to find things to eat no matter what we were, if we were even an amoeba, and we had to not be eaten ourselves. So we had to have two brains, one always sort of focused on what we could find and use, and the other focused on the whole surroundings, so we're not like being snuck up on by some kind of predator. And so that's the basis of all of life, and we evolved out of that. So we have these two brains, and the right hemisphere, so thinks in that holistic, symbolic, metaphoric way. And his argument really is that the left, the one that's focused and narrow-minded and has these like rubrics that it lives by, is the center of the world right now, and that we're sort of forgetting about the holistic understandings of the right brain. And so when we make art, what we're really doing is shutting off that left brain, getting it out of the way so we can make newness and have those symbols come up. And I think, is there a way that you get into the zone? That's one of the things that we talk about sometimes is, you have to be in this like mental space to write a poem. You have to turn off that self-critic, that willful will that like makes you think, oh, I'm going to write a great poem or I'm going to write a great song. You have to shut that voice off and then let that subconscious part of your brain take over. Is there anything that you do to enter that space of creativity where you're, letting that holistic right brain think instead of your left?
Yeah, dude, you are so talking my language now. Brain science and the right left schizophrenia of each of our consciousness. I'm so all about it. And couldn't agree more that the left brain has been in charge of society, and the design of the world now is all an invention of the left brain, which I would elaborate to say is the masculine side of our nature. So therefore, patriarchy, therefore, this sort of masculine bent to the structure of society, politics, and that the right side, the intuitive, the creative, the emotional, the et cetera, pattern oriented, that's the feminine side of our nature. Now, of course, all of us possess both, right? Yes, and they're in interplay. And what I find so fascinating about being a poet or a writer, a songwriter, is that, yes, it all starts with the right brain's way of knowing. It's the intuition. It's the muse. It's the antenna that sticks up from the right brain and draws things in from, you can't explain where. You can't say by logic where that feeling comes from or that sense that you're pursuing. But then you're translating it all, you're bringing it to life through language, which is the greatest invention of the left brain, I would say. It's the one that begat all others, the written word. So I've been long fascinated by this tension of using the left brain and its great tool, the biggest hammer it ever fashioned, to try to hammer out the knowing of the right brain and communicate it and share it through time and space and help unlock it in people. So I think there's a really fascinating tension going on with any writer of using, the linear, logical, very concrete tool of language to go beyond itself. And I think that's what poetry does. It takes this concrete, finite, because, anytime you say the word for something, you have reduced it. It is always more than that. And even when you find the most perfect word to describe exactly what you can most accurately describe it, it's still more than that. You can only, but what poetry can do, which was why I love it the most, and even when it's set to music, it's that you're using this finite reductive tool to break its own borders.
Yeah. Well, that's the fundamental story of humanity, really, is that yin yang. I mean, you talk about masculine and feminine, it's like the hunter gatherer type thing too, like that binary.
Yes.
And we're all, each of us, both of them together. And McGilchrist's argument, his newest book is the matter with things, and his argument is that part of the brain's taken over so much that we're sort of drowning in our own lack of our own rigidity, and so I just think it's such an important thing. That's why I think poetry is so valuable, and what you do is so valuable. It was so cool to hear you talk about the brain, because I was wondering, I love this line from the new album, You Forget to Speak is one of the songs from there. And I think the first stanza, or the first verse, is between first sleep and second sleep, I stare into the dark, and I can feel there are two of me, so I put them both on the ark. I was thinking, just hearing that line. It only came out 2 days ago, but listening to it, hearing that line, I was thinking about how we're multiple selves. I'm large, I contain multitudes. That Whitman, and and it really is like the all of everything. No matter where you go, if it's a creative enterprise, it's riding that like line between order and chaos to make yourself a bridge between the parts of you. Yeah, it's cool to hear that you're interested in that too.
Yeah. Oh, so much. I think McGilchrist and I are kindred spirits. I'm doing and thinking about all the same things, and they pop up all over this new album. And that song you forgot to speak is very much it's about being conflicted,
Mm-hmm.
basically in essence. And you don't know, say, for instance, am I in an abusive relationship with a toxic person, or am I in a human relationship with a fallible person who's fallible like I? And do I need to keep working on this and keep finding my way to forgiveness and understanding, and work with this person like I work with myself towards forgiveness and understanding and growth, and what's true when you feel different ways at different times, just as an example. Um, and I think I think basically what feeling conflicted, quote unquote, is about is when your right brain, your intuitive knowing, your intuition says turn right, and your logic says, I think I'm supposed to keep going straight, or maybe I should turn left because somebody said I should turn left. And your intuition is saying right, 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 right.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
your left brain is saying left. I think it's when your two hemispheres are in conflict, that is what conflicted means, of course. And so I think it's that left brain, that logic, trying to drown out and dictate to your intuitive knowing.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very much what that song is about. And I think a lot of the themes on this record revolve around exactly what we're talking
Mm-hmm.
about.
Yeah, the other psychologist I talked to for an issue is James Pennebaker at the University of Texas, and he does expressive writing as healing. And he's actually studied this, and that's his conclusion basically, because he took students in, had them write expressively. Just freshman students would come in and write about their most traumatic experience. He would ask them, and then the control group wrote about whatever they wanted. And he followed them throughout the year and did studies on how good their grades were, how well they slept, how their actual blood work they had better. And so the group that wrote about their traumas and expressed them and got them out, actually had better health and better grades and worked better. And so his whole career is built on, helping people through that. And what it really comes down to is when you have that conflict between the parts of yourself where they can't speak because they speak totally different languages. You have that conflict. You're like two people and you're like fighting yourself. And I think the main thing maybe is you can't sleep because your right brain's sending you these nightmare dreams over and over again. Trying to like wake you up, and your left brain is saying, shut up, I know what I'm doing. And the whole time it's just this conflict. And so you have all this stress and anxiety that builds up. And so that's what, poetry and really all art does, is it makes this bridge between the parts of ourselves so we can heal and become more whole. And so much of your work does that too, I think. You can look at your, knowing, maybe a lot about your like life biography, through your songs. And it's so often they resonate because they're yourself healing through creativity. Right. So do you feel that way? Like, are certain songs really like got you through a moment in life?
I feel precisely that way. Exactly. Man, Pennebaker, these conversations that you are having and bringing forward in this community of thought that you're creating with your magazine and the podcast, I feel so at home in it, and lucky to be talking to you. Yeah, creative writing as healing is exactly what it's about. It's always been about it for me. I've experienced what Pennebaker verified scientifically. I mean, one example that always stands out in my mind. I had this experience where, at the height of my notoriety or fame or whatever, say in the late 90s, early aughts, there was a lot of things I was encountering that went along with it, stalkers. I mean, I've had them since. It's just a thing, right? People, stalkers or threats. But there was this one event that happened in the early aughts where I came home. I was living in Buffalo at the time, and I came home and I went upstairs in the dark because I know my home and I don't need to turn on lights. And I went into my room in the dark, and there was a man waiting for me there. I had left my back door unlocked, and all's well that ends well, or so my left brain told me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
My left brain invented all sorts of stories about how I'm invincible and it's fine. And I wasn't even going to tell anybody because I didn't want to worry anybody or set off any chain of events. And now Ani has to have a bodyguard and this and that. But what happened as a result of a lot of things in my life building up, and then that event, and I started having panic attacks. Physically, my body was just these aftershocks of just, levels of anxiety and stress that I couldn't come below. And I was having these sort of heart attack feelings. I mean, anybody who's had panic attacks knows what I'm talking about. So it was this crippling physical manifestation. And it was going on for months. And then I finally sat down and I wrote pretty much in one go. I mean, I think I revised a little in retrospect, but I wrote a poem called Parameters, which ended up on a record called Knuckle Down. And it was about that event. And I felt the change in my body. It was so palpable from before the poem to after. It was, which it had always sort of been in a general sense and in an overarching sense in my life. I've always written to heal. But that was remarkable. I mean, the panic attacks didn't stop in an instant, but it was a steep de-escalation and an off-ramp. And it was exactly because of letting it out of my body through poetry.
Yeah. That's just such a great example of how it works. And, and that's how, and then through poetry, we have this artifact of that experience, where, there's the poem / song parameters that we get to experience and see that bridge that you forged for yourself interiorly. Emily Dickinson said that I know it's a poem if it takes the top of my head off. There's that feeling of like you get goosebumps, and I think what it is, it's like a spark of lightning, jumping that gap between cells. Lightning starts out with this little step leader, and then that opens up a bridge, and then zap, the whole imbalance discharges itself, and that's really how lightning works, and that's really what a great poem does, or a great song, and then we get to experience and be a part of it too. The other thing,
and that lightning. Wait, I just want to add too, because it seems so connected to, that lightning. It's like the synapse. It's finding a new way. It's finding an exit out of the trauma, out of the and it's finally writing the relationship between the master and the emissary. It's the right brain has become the master, is driving and is using the left brain, its language, its linear thought structures to free it, to free the body, to free the self, to grow the self. So it's that finally writing that relationship where the intuitive, emotional knowing is in charge, and the logical side of the brain is helping it to operate instead of, the left brain being in charge.
Yeah, really well said. And the other thing I wanted to bring up too, there's sort of this other continuum I wanted to ask you about. And I realized it when we did a slam poetry issue way back in like 2007 or 8 or so. And so I went to a lot of performance poetry events. I mean, you've had poets on tour, which is really cool, including Buddy Wakefield, and Andrea Gibson and slam poets like that, which is really cool.
Yeah.
But so I went to a lot of slam poetry after doing this magazine for a while and focusing on page poetry stuff, and I realized that there's something completely. It's so strange. It's like this continuum. It's like a funnel shaped difference where in a slam, in a performance poem, or in a concert or something, we're getting lost in the crowd, kind of like what we want is to, and so you get that same thing. You're like hanging on every word, and the fact that there's like 2,000 people in the room, all thinking the same thing, all having their sort of heartbeat at the same rhythm, and so we lose our sense of self in the crowd within a concert type thing. But then way on the far other end with poetry, where you're reading on the page, you're losing yourself in another person's voice. Because with a poem on the page, you're reading it. You as a reader are like the instrument that the writer is playing. Like your breath becomes their breath, and so they're playing you. And you lose yourself that way on this really intimate individual level. And so there's this like huge, like they're both trying to lose yourself to understand and have more empathy and be sort of greater and bigger than yourself is I think why we're drawn to both. But one, we're losing ourselves in a crowd, and the other, we're losing ourselves in like a point, like an individual singularity or something. And so there's that big contrast between the two. And what's always been fascinating about your work and what you do is that the conflict is there within you, it feels like to me, because you have all these times back, at least in the 90s and aughts, where the audience singing along would be sort of difficult, because you're trying to voice your poems / songs in your own way, and they're just like singing back the radio version at you, and so there's this like dichotomy of both that complete intimate singularity versus the crowd sort of competing with each other, and it felt like that was like culminated in the song "Swim," where it's like you're drowning in that din and trying to find yourself again. But could you talk about that conflict? I don't even have a great question to form. I'm just curious what your thoughts are about that way that the two operate in like different ways, but toward the same thing.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And you were using the, losing yourself, and I was thinking, and then you went there, you grow yourself. Yeah, you lose this false idea of yourself as an individual, as an isolated, autonomous thing, with borders, and you enter the understanding of yourself as being vast and containing everything and everyone. And so, you feel that in a room full of people, like you say, whose hearts are beating in rhythm and who are all, breathing together, and something is evolving amongst all of you. It's incredibly liberating and real to exit this idea of being alone in this body, in this world. And on the page, I see this dichotomy that you're looking at, where it's sort of you enter another individual, but the effect is the same. I'm not alone, and I am very much this other person. Therefore, I am very much every person and every being. And we are actually, all just drops of a unified field of consciousness, and we are all united in that way. And so, yes, they're different, it seems like different mediums, really, the spoken word and the written word, but towards the same understanding, the same revelation. And I've always leaned towards the spoken. For whatever reason, I love being in time and space with other beings, being near them and feeling that energetic exchange. When you write it down on a piece of paper and you send it off into the ether, you're not there to feel that. It happens behind your back somewhere that you can't see. So it's not as exciting or gratifying. I remember when I wrote a memoir, it was hundreds of pages of complete sentences, and I just hit send, and there was this deafening
Mm.
silence, for somebody that's used to hearing the response, whether it's a cacophony of not necessarily thoughtful singing drowning me out, or it's whatever it is, there's an exchange, and you can feel the response. That felt really weird to
Mm.
me. Putting books in the world is like, uh, um, it's such a non-event. You just have to have faith that somewhere somebody connects in.
Yeah, well, weirdly, I think poets will be, happy to hear that, somebody who had a memoir that was like actually got publicity and people would read on a big press. You feel the same way as when you publish a little poetry book that you also feel like, you're throwing into
Right.
the void that nobody really.
Did it reach anybody?
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
What was it like to actually write that memoir? That's one of the things I was curious about because we, poets too, we find this way, this sort of mode of becoming creative, and it's very, specific to what we're doing. And so I assume songwriting is the same. You know how to write songs and be creative to create that sort of mental, meditative energy, that state. You know how to do that, but then when you're sitting down to write a book, I think everybody struggles. So many poets have this idea of, I want to write this book, I have a novel in the back of my head, it's going to be great, but they never do it because it's so different than writing, what you're used to writing, what you've taught yourself through those, 10,000 hours of practice, what to do. So what was it like
Yeah.
writing a memoir? How much of a struggle was it?
Such a struggle, so hard. And I would have now, I actually have a novel that I've been thinking about and not writing really, except in little, it'll never come to be, I'm sure. My advice would be go involve other people. If you actually want to write this novel, get somebody with an expectation in the world. Tell somebody you're going on a diet, and then you have to, because you told somebody, and you got somebody invested in whatever way in the idea. If I hadn't, my manager took me to a book agent, and this book agent went and found a publisher, and I got all these people on board, and I said I was going to write a book. So then I just simply had to. And I didn't think I could. And for a long time, I was right. Just the remembering, because of course, writing poems and songs, you can use the kind of memory that I think a lot of us artists have, which is not linear, which is not names and dates and times. And it's moments and images and fragments and feelings, and that kind of memory is very applicable to songs and poems. uh you know Complete sentences, hundreds of pages at a time. It took me months and months and months of staring off into space to go, oh, right, that thing. And then a few more months of, oh, no, right, that thing came before that thing, not after. I mean, it was like it was like a puzzle. It was doing a very big puzzle of
Mm-hmm.
my life of, oh, no, that doesn't make sense unless I talk about that other thing that was actually the thing. And it's very different from writing poems and songs.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever get to the point where you were enjoying the process, or was it kind of like trudging up a mountain to eventually have the view at the top, but it's miserable all the way?
Mostly trudging,
Mm-hmm.
mostly, yeah, at the time when I was sort of doing interviews after it was finished, I would describe it as, writing a song is like you said, like a flash. It comes down, like something comes through, and then you try to hold on to it long enough to, build it out. And writing the book was like whittling. It was just whittling. I just sat there. I was dying to have a moment with myself, but really I was just sitting there. And there was a few moments along the way where I would get excited, where I would feel, okay, okay, I know how to do this. I know how to get there. But those moments felt few and far between in this sort of years of whittling.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
maybe that's the patience of authors, of fiction writers. I felt like it was just a whole new level of patience and stick-to-itiveness that I had never been challenged with.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, another opportunity to grow too. As a human being, trying to do something totally different and challenging is always, adding to what you can do and what you can do is great too. And speaking of that too, you've also written children's
Mm.
books. So The Knowing came out last year, I think, or a couple of years ago. And what was it that made you want to do that? Because I've thought about children's books too, because it's poetry basically. I mean, The Knowing is basically a poem.
Mhm.
So what
Yeah.
was it that made you want to write that book? How did it come to be?
Well, the pandemic. So my job was one that just evaporated with the lockdown, gathering people together and playing and expirating at them. Not so much during a pandemic. So when I couldn't tour, I was looking for all different ways to whatever, support my family, pay my rent, be an artist in the world. And when I released the memoir, the children's book department of Penguin Random House contacted me at that time and said, "Hey, if you ever wanted to think about a book for young readers, let us know." So when the pandemic hit, I finally answered that email. I said, "How about now?" And it was super challenging in a weird way. You'd think it's easy. It seems easy, doesn't it? When you read children's books, it's like, oh, it's just simple and small and, very basic. But for me as a writer, I mean, the first thing that the the lead of this department said to me is, okay, you have to leave the metaphor at the
Oh,
door.
really?
Kids, no, kids, you can't confuse kids with metaphors. That's not how they think. They're not there yet. You have to say it directly. And I was like, what?
Well, I don't know. I don't know if that's true because we have
I don't know.
one of the
I
things
don't know
we do
either.
a young
And
poets anthology that we publish. It just came
uh,
out actually, the summer one, and we have they're like 3 or 4, and they're using metaphor, and they're
you
great.
know what,
So
dude?
I don't
I
know if
couldn't
that's.
agree
I
with
think
you
that
more.
might be.
That was exactly my thought, but she was my boss.
Yeah.
Again, you get these entities involved, and that was a humbling experience because I really did have a boss who told me straight away, "No, let's tone down with the metaphors," you know, and I had been commissioned to do the book,
Hmm.
so I needed to push myself in the direction she bid me. Also, I was hoping to do the artwork for the book, but she said in no uncertain terms, "No, we're going to bring somebody in." So
Yeah, that's right too.
okay,
We had Ted Kooser, the poet laureate, from the 2008 or so. He did a children's book too, and the exact same thing. He's like, this friend of mine's going to be the artist, and they were like, no, no, we find the artist, buddy.
yeah, yeah,
Sorry.
work for hire, baby,
Yeah,
work for
exactly.
hire.
But
It's a
those people,
different.
it reminds me of the people who say, they think that on TV we just want these like 30-second sound bites, and that's all should be, and then when podcasts come up and these long form discussions like this are what people actually crave, and they would say
Yeah.
it never works on TV to have anybody be interested for more than 5 seconds. You need to get your little
Mm.
sound bites out, but that's not at all. There's just this old stultified way to go back to
Yeah.
that left brain thing. They're just caught in a left brain world, and it's not
Yeah, a
true.
loop.
So but anyway, it's interesting to
Yeah.
hear that about the
Well,
kids book.
well, just to your point of stretching yourself in new directions, just to see if you
Hmm.
can, I had to get myself in that headspace, like, okay, let me try to do it how she's envisioning it, because
Hmm.
that's what this situation is. And maybe at some point in the future, I honestly do think I might try to do a kid's book without, on my own
Hmm.
in whatever way um, appeals to me. But it was super challenging to write the knowing. Um, I mean, I think a lot of what I do, is, of course, like we've talked about, metaphor is at the core of it. And also just playing with preconceived notions, or turning cliches on their heads or sort of double entendres. I love that, all that stuff,
Uh-huh.
playing with culture and challenging culture. And um, again, all of this means nothing to a child in
Yeah.
a glorious way. They are not embedded in all the preconceived notions and thwarting them or turning them on their head or doing the unexpected thing with the expected, because they don't expect anything. They're
Mm-hmm.
new here. So I really had to check all of that, this stuff that I've been, you know, enjoying and indulging in my writing up till now. Like I had
Mm-hmm.
to check it at the door and kind of try a new approach. So it was unexpectedly challenging.
Yeah, what I was looking, I remember, looking at that book for the first time, and I had this because I was wondering if you had the same one, where when you have two kids, I had kids, so I was reading them children's books all the time, and so many, especially the newer ones, have no sense of music or no sense of poetry,
Mm.
and I would have to I would read them once, we get them from the library, and I start reading it. And with the meter being so off, it's like trying to have some rhyme, and the rhymes are like in the wrong
Yeah.
place, and it's just like hard to even
Yeah.
read with any kind of ear. And I would like take those books and like we can't read these books anymore,
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so when I got the note, I opened that up and I was like, I bet, as a songwriter that it's going to have, even if you don't study, verse formally and don't know which meter it's using or whatever, that the ear will play itself out, and it totally does. So it's one of the books that actually works. But there's so
Yeah,
many books
I'm
that
with
don't
you. The
nowadays. And
rhythm.
yeah, and children's books, it has so much to do with our, acquiring language and feeling that music and speaking the language of that right brain. And it's just so important, And so to have these like clunky, ugly, non-musical books that are like retelling, the Paw Patrol episode or whatever, it's just, I mean, what a lost opportunity. And so, so
Mm.
having a book that's musically, and I was wondering if that was part of your motivation for it.
Yeah, totally. Those are my favorite books too, having a couple of kids now, that are practically grown. When I started reading books to my kids, I felt the same way you do, and with these challenges that the children's department at Penguin put before me of like, nah, let's not so much for the metaphors and let's say it directly. And yeah, your whole like playing with, we need to be simple and direct. I was just struggling. I was struggling. So the only way that I got through it was picking up the guitar. I just
Oh,
thought,
really?
okay,
Mm-hmm.
so I wrote it as a song, which is actually the last song on this new record, Unprecedented Shit. The knowing um, is there in song form. And that was the only way that I just even made the thing, was to write it as a song. So yes, it very much rhymes and has the sort of meter of a
Mm-hmm.
song.
Oh, that's interesting. Because I listened to it yesterday, and I thought, and my thought was, oh, that's like inspired by the book, but a more sophisticated version. I didn't realize it was the
It's the
same.
exact
Yeah.
words.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's funny. And it's really
Yeah.
cool that it comes out that way. Another thing I want to talk about was the cancel culture kind of thing. You had that incident where, you played at a venue that, you know, got you in hot water. And the same thing has happened to me too in the past, where you're like stuck, you're like grinding it out, working like a lot, and there's personal stress, and you sort of make a mistake, and then it feels like the whole world pounces on you. And it's such a, so when you were going through that was something that I was, relating to a lot. And what I'm wondering, I guess, it's such a difficult experience, to have. It feels like everybody's turning on you, and there's this whole, speaking of evolution again, I think there's this whole evolutionary mechanism that we develop because we're tribal creatures, and being excommunicated from your tribe was like a death sentence. So we have this sort of feeling of like panic, like a drowning response to a crowd criticizing us. And we're trying to like do good in the world. And so then you start to wonder and you start to like grovel and apologize and wonder if you are a terrible person. And you see people go through this over and over again. And it's just so heartbreaking to me. And so I wonder, like, but at the same time, it's a chance to grow too. We're talking about that too. And it's a traumatic thing to go through, but it's also a point of learning about yourself and the world more too. So I was wondering about that for you. Like, do you feel, Are you happy that that happened in a strange way? Because I kind of feel that myself a little bit, even though it's so hard, and there's still like a PTSD about it still too that just lingers. But what are your thoughts about that sort of event?
You're a bigger person than I to be grateful for
Well, I'm
that.
trying to be grateful.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
mean,
no,
you
I
can
mean,
see it through that frame. It's
I
hard though,
guess
and I
me
don't think
too.
people
I
who
guess,
haven't been through it know how hard it is. Because there is this like,
yeah,
it's like a death of a certain part of yourself
it
too. Speaking
is.
of all the different parts, and all the
Yeah.
self criticism that comes along with it and stuff. It's really difficult. So yeah.
Yeah, it was for me too. It's just so seismic. I still am sort of altered in my cells. The reverberations of fear and self-doubt continue,
Hmm.
and it just devastated me for years, and it just everything, yeah, it was like your whole life gets in a car and goes over a cliff.
Hmm.
And um it for me, I mean, I guess the lesson, one of the big core lessons for me is you've been getting away with getting your sense of yourself and your worth, and your worthiness, and from outside, from others,
Hmm.
but when it comes back at you in a really fierce way, in its opposite form of you're bad and you're terrible and you're unworthy and you're evil, and you should, then all you're left with is, do you believe in yourself? Can you love yourself when you feel the rest of the world hate you? um, can you do that job for yourself, which was something I, am still trying to learn. I think so many of us are. We are walking this earth with a feeling of unworthiness. I think really all the ways that we mistreat each other come from our own feelings of unworthiness.
Hmm.
Those of us that it's a rare, rare human that has achieved actual self-love, actual self-acceptance, and those people are the kindest, most enlightened, most compassionate people on the earth. And there are very few amongst us, and the rest of us hate ourselves. And therein lies that's the catch, So it really challenged me in a way, a completely unprecedented way, to can you love yourself through this?
Hmm.
Because there seems to be nobody left who believes in your goodness or in your worth,
Hmm.
so I think that was an important, like you say, I mean, if I look at it in my biggest, bravest way, yeah, that was a really important wall for my back to be up against,
Hmm.
but yeah, it's crazy how it happens and what it does. And my friend Buddy Wakefield, a wonderful poet that you mentioned earlier, he made the mistake. He was one of the poets that I had wrangled in to be one of my co-faculty teachers at this writing seminar that became the controversial event. And he made the mistake of standing up for me.
Well, I don't
And
think it's a
then,
mistake to stand up for your friends. I think
well,
I mean,
yeah,
it's
yeah, thanks. I mean, of
yeah.
course, it meant everything to me, but the fallout for him then became exponential.
Hmm.
And he got as persecuted, so yeah, it was, yeah, it's really interesting when that happens, of course, to see what the people in your life,
Hmm.
you don't, you can't hardly fault people for running in the other direction,
Yeah.
and leaving you there. And then, but Buddy, of course, I will always, um, be grateful to him for staying with me at the scene of the accident, you know?
Yeah. Well, those people are so precious and so few. I mean, it's that herd mentality again, and we don't want to be the gazelle standing out by our own, and so we all flock with the herd and don't stand up for our friends sometimes, and it really is heartbreaking. The other thing that's crazy about it is that it's not a big deal to most people who are even like talking about it. I mean, like
Right,
I didn't know it was a bigger issue for you. Even though I follow your work, I love your music. I've listened to all your albums as they come out and everything. And I knew that happened, but to me, I didn't think it was a big thing until I read a Rolling Stone interview just the other day, and there was like a paragraph about it, and I related to that so much because it's the same kind of thing. And there's all this stuff swirling around, and it's people that don't actually care. They just get this, dopamine hit out of being morally self-righteous that pile on, and then they go away to the next thing. And and there's this whole wake of people that are just traumatized, left behind, and it's just really
yeah,
heartbreaking to me. Some people can stand up and keep doing it, but there's so many people that you never hear from again. And
yeah, yeah,
I mean, if you can sort of rebuild and find that love for yourself again and keep making and doing what you do, great. But a lot of people, I think, just don't have those outlets, and it's just this psychological wound that's like they're carrying around forever. When most people were involved, you'd have to remind them about it, and say, oh yeah, and they'd be, oh, I
yeah,
remember that
yeah,
thing.
I
It's just
know, isn't
so
that crazy?
dehumanizing and heartless. And
Yeah, it's like you got axe murdered and most people just forgot about it the next day, but
yeah, I
you
know,
sure don't.
yeah,
Yeah,
it's true.
that's what the feeling is. There's an incredible documentary out there, and I'm forgetting the name of it, but it's narrated by Monica Lewinsky, and
Hmm.
it's about cancel culture, and it follows different people on their journeys of being canceled on the internet. And these different stories, the people are more or less culpable or guilty of what they're being accused of or what happened to them. But it's a really well done documentary, and it shows you that it almost doesn't matter if you're guilty or not guilty or how wrong were you. The forces at play are the same
Hmm.
and are indiscriminate almost. And it almost, even the sort of more guilty parties to what they were canceled for, you can see in them a fallible human being, much like you or I or anyone who made a mistake, surely, but being kicked off the planet is always an extreme result.
Hmm.
But yes, I just have such empathy and um, fear for young people now,
Hmm.
especially young artists who are coming of age and into their own in the age of gotcha. Like,
Hmm.
how do you? I think of my formative years and all of the mistakes I made on stage into a microphone, trying to articulate something or nothing, or the bars that I got hot and took my shirt off because it was hot. And imagine, I look back and I think of that whole decade of the 90s, say, and think, what if that was all online forever?
Yeah.
For everyone to scrutinize and judge for eternity globally, whoa.
Hmm.
Uh, I wouldn't be here talking to you. I wouldn't exist, and I really feel for young people. I think that it's a great deterrent.
Hmm.
I look around at, I mean, I have a teenager. One of my kids is 17. The other is 11. They're just coming into themselves. And I feel like I see a lot of very young people who are not very motivated
Hmm.
to step step out there, put
Yeah.
themselves out there, try something, just try to do anything. And I really feel deeply and intuitively that incredible tool, that world that we're all carrying around in our pocket, that access to information and community and all of these great things, that the shadow side of it is that beware, beware. Don't
Yeah.
try to do anything because it's too risky, you know?
Yeah, in a lot of ways it is too. I mean, yeah, and it's so hard. It must be to be any kind of creative. Like I always think of for what I want for my kids. I have a boy and a girl. They're 13 and 9, and I want them to be like the most self-actualized, most version of themselves. Is the whole goal. It's to make them be the most they can be, and to have that fear and the pressure everywhere. Just I don't know how you can
Right.
be stretch out,
Yeah.
which is the goal of life, is to be the most life you
Yeah.
can be, and how you can stretch out and do that when in the face of this culture that we have. And so I find it really frightening too. Is there any way to get back into writing songs, and to be not have, because what it is, it's that left brain, that rigid thinking of the left brain, and you're sort of follow all these rules so you don't stand out from the crowd and be persecuted, and you have to turn that off to make art. So is there a way that you it was a struggle to get back into songwriting?
Oh, yeah. I wanted to just disappear. Yeah. Yeah. I didn't, yeah. It, it was, I was just moved through the world very afraid, very timid, very shut down for, a few years. So yeah, it was a long ramp back into, oh, fuck it.
Yeah.
And it's still, like I said, I'm not the same version of fuck it that I used to be. Um, but yeah, I mean, just to wrap back around to say the knowing, that children's book slash song slash poem, what I, one of the great motivator behind it was to connect with young people about the idea that no matter what you're called, no matter what labels anyone ever puts on you or you put on yourself, no matter what adjectives are you oh so pretty, or are you oh so smart, or are you oh so shy, or are you stupid and dumb and this and that, no matter what somebody calls you, black, white, tall, this, that, you are more than that. That's what the purpose of the book is. You are something much more essential than that none of those adjectives will ever touch. And so know that about yourself, that you, like wrapping back even further into our conversation, are a being of light. You are light, and you just look like a person with a certain countenance and a certain this, that, or the other hue or make or model or gender or something, but all of that is the surface, and underneath you are infinite. You are a being of infinite possibility, so, and I think kids are naturally, and again, without the pressure of social media and these gizmos that say, create an identity, invest in it, hone it, perform it all day long, perfect it, stick with it. If you want to be vivid, don't change tomorrow and the next day and the next day, because that's less effective. And find all your labels, put them in a big list, and perform it. It's like a full-time job identity now in this world of two dimensions. So I just wanted to connect with young people who I hope are still connected to that field of infinite possibility that they actually are, and that they come from, and that they recognize in themselves and each other before story kicks in, before all the stories.
Yeah.
That's real. Your sense of that is really real.
Yeah. Well, we see it, in the in the Young Poets Anthology that we do, because kids write really brilliant, creative, interesting, strange, full of metaphors and weird things up until about the age of 13 or so. And then that's when the self-consciousness kicks in and they become, and you can just see it, like there's a line in the poems where it goes from
Wow.
being this spontaneous
Yeah.
self-expression of their creativity to performative, trying to impress their teacher or their friend or their parents, or
Yeah.
or being the person they want to put out into the world. And it's about that
Yeah.
rather than that deeper creative force that we all are, like, at our hearts. Like, that's what we are as humans, but they're
Yeah.
so buried on top of that is all the cultural baggage that we're just thrust with, and we're just heaping piles of it by the time we're a teenager. And then
Yeah.
with
I
social
mean, of
media, it just
course,
becomes everything.
yeah.
Yeah.
And but of course, identity is also important, and exploring it and finding it, who you are, where you come from, what your community is, what's your, all of that is so valuable on a certain level. And, I'm a child of the 70s, so a tool of liberation, identity politics, all different kinds of people standing up and saying, hey, guess what? Me too. And I have a different way of knowing and seeing and living. And um, so all of that can be very liberating and crucial to our becoming ourselves. But back to the master and emissary, if it's in charge, it's got to be this tool of liberation, or it becomes its opposite.
Yeah, well, really well said. It's a great way to round out the interview. It's past the hour I
Hmm.
promised it would take, but it's so fun to talk to you. Do you have,
Oh, too
by any
much fun.
chance, could you read a poem or recite something for the radio version? Because we do like a cold intro of a poem. It'd be good to have if you have anything you could do.
Um, yeah, I'm afraid I'd have to just, I don't have any of my books here, so I'd have to go reach back into sort of my memory banks for older poems that, if you don't
I
mind.
do. Oh, they're great. I just
Um,
love it. Just
okay, all right. Well, the one that's coming to mind that I think I know in my brain, that maybe is related to our conversation is my IQ. Um, okay, let's see if I know this. Um, when I was 4 years old, they tried to test my IQ. They showed me this picture of three oranges and a pear, and they asked me, which one is different? It does not belong. They taught me different is wrong. But when I was 13 years old, I woke up one morning, thighs covered in blood, like a war, like a warning that I live in a breakable, takeable body, an ever increasingly valuable body, that a woman had come in the night to replace me, deface me. See, my body is borrowed. I got it on loan for the time in between my mom and some maggots. I don't need anyone to hold me. I can hold my own. I've got highways for stretch marks. See where I've grown. And I sing sometimes like my life is at stake, because you're only as loud as the noises you make. I'm learning to laugh as hard as I can listen, because silence is violence in women and poor people. If more people were screaming, then I could relax. But a good brain in diddly if you don't have the facts. We live in a breakable, takeable world, an ever available, possible world. And we can make music like we can make do. Genius is in a backseat to nothing if you're dancing, especially something stupid like IQ. For
Yeah.
every lie I unlearn, I learn something new. And I sing sometimes for the war that I fight, because every tool is a weapon if you hold it right.
Yeah, that's just beautiful, Ani. Thanks so much for reading that. Really cool to hear. And if anybody was wondering why, I want to interview you for the musician poets issue, that's it right there. I mean, you have poems that are that great on a lot of your albums, and including poetry everywhere. Really appreciate that you do that too. And it's just so great getting to talk to you. I really appreciate it.
Oh, so great to talk to you too. Absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you.